In this lesson, we're going to be looking at a feature of 3ds Max called radiosity. Now, this is another method by which 3ds Max can calculate indirect illumination. Alright, so we've already had a chance to look at the light tracer, which is one method that 3ds Max has to calculate indirect lighting and indirect illumination, and radiosity is the other method. Now, at the end of the day, you can get very similar results from these two different calculations, but underneath, they both work very, very differently. So the light tracer is really considered to be a non-physically accurate simulation of this indirect lighting. So it's really more of an approximation, whereas radiosity is considered to be much more accurate. So this radiosity, there are a few things that we'll need to keep in mind. Number one, if we want this radiosity to work properly, we need to use a photometric light. Right? Now, since a photometric light is, as we mentioned in an earlier lesson, based on real-world units, when you're using radiosity with any kind of a photometric light, again, you do have to make sure that your scene is modeled out to the appropriate scale. So in our case, again, we have a room modeled out where real-world units, we have a ceiling height of about 8 feet tall. All right. So the first thing that we need to do is get our lights set up and in place, and then we can start to do the radiosity calculation. So let's come back to one of our views here. And so we'll start by setting up a few different photometric lights. So let's drop in a target light, and it's going to ask if we want to use the logarithmic exposure. Go ahead and click yes. Alright, so let's start with this little floodlight up here along the ceiling. So let's add in a light. And if we need to, we'll always come back and reposition this. There we go. Oops, looks like I grabbed the wrong thing. Let's deselect that and make sure that we do grab this target for the light. Alright, and now with both of those, we should be able to come in and reposition this. Just move this guy over. Alright, so this is going to be our kind of floodlight up here along the top. So let's select this light. And with the actual light selected, there we go. Let's go ahead and plug in a IES light profile. So we'll switch this to a photometric web. Plug in our photometric file. There we go. Alright, so there's the light that's being splashed down along this wall. So overall, though, this room is still very, very dark. So let's add one or two more lights into this scene before we actually begin the radiosity calculation. So again, let's switch to a different viewport. And let's add in another photometric light. Again, this can be either a target light or a free light. Okay, so there we are. And let's go back to our modify panel for this. And maybe just give it a basic 100 watt bulb preset. Alright, I might actually come down and maybe warm up these colors, rather cool it a little bit more. Maybe give it a little bit higher temperature so that it's not quite so warm and quite so orange in color. Right, and if necessary, we can always brighten this up a little bit by just increasing the lux value at a certain distance. Alright, so let's see what that does for us. Alright, you can see getting a little bit better. So let's come in and maybe even give this a little bit brighter light. So maybe start to increase the lux values of that. And again, maybe just start to dial up its intensity a little bit more so that it reaches a little bit further. Alright, so there we are. This actually might turn out to be a little bit too high of a value. Once we start to get the radiosity calculated, you'll see it'll actually start to add a lot of light into the scene. So I might actually just kind of choke this back a little bit more. Alright, again, we can always start to come back and make these changes as we see fit. So let's go ahead and for this 100 watt bulb, let's give it some ray trace shadows. Right, and if we want, we can go ahead and do the same for this little splash light over here. So we'll give this some ray trace shadows as well, and see what we get. Okay, So overall, it's fairly dark, but what we can start to do is now begin the process of using radiosity to start to do some indirect light calculation and start to splash some of this light around. So let's begin by going to our render setup. Take a look in the Advanced Lighting tab. Right, same place that we activated the light tracer a few lessons back. Now we'll activate radiosity instead. Alright, now radiosity works a little bit differently than the light tracer in that it actually stores this illumination data in the vertices of your geometry. So what's going to happen is the more geometry you have, or the denser your mesh, the more of this indirect illumination data can be stored at a per vertex level. And we can actually tell Max to kind of selectively subdivide this mesh in order to store the data that it needs. So let's start by just taking some of this initial quality, and let's start with something a little bit lower, just so we can keep our renders moving at a relatively decent pace. So once we have this set up, let's just start by beginning the radiosity calculation. Right, so you can see it's going to go through and process the direct illumination. It's going to calculate the radiosity and return a result. All right, so once it's done, you should actually now start to see this data being represented back in the viewport. Right, so right now it's not all that great because we really don't have a whole lot of geometry to be able to store all of this data. Now if I press F4 on my keyboard, you can actually see how Max has tried to kind of subdivide this geometry in order to try to store some data. But overall there's really not that many vertices in this, so as a consequence it's really not able to store that much data. But what we should see is whenever we render, once this radiosity takes place, or once this radiosity calculation has already happened, that data is now stored in the vertices, so it really doesn't have to go through and calculate all over again. Right? Once I calculate it once, it's pretty much done. And now you can see that we have now a little bit more of a soft appearance to a lot of this lighting. So now we get a little bit softer appearance underneath these shadows. They're not quite so pitch black. Alright, so we're at right now kind of a decent starting point for the radiosity. Well, what we'll do in the next lesson is take a look at some additional settings that we can start to use to really dramatically improve this result.